Trade talks between the US and Canada have collapsed spectacularly, and we're seeing Donald Trump's trade war return once again. American media are already reporting that both sides have announced the introduction of new high tariffs, which is described as, quote, an unprecedented breakdown in relations with the United States' second largest trading partner. Washington has already imposed 50% tariffs on most Canadian goods, and Ottawa has promised to respond with similar measures. Negotiations between Trump and Prime Minister Carney, as well as the trade representatives of the two countries, continued throughout the week. The day before, the American president even managed to announce that an agreement had been reached, but he clarified that it still needed to be finalized. Well, with Trump, as they say, it's always the same. First, he announced the deal, and then he himself ruined it. US Trade Representative Jamieson Greer said that Washington had offered Canada more favorable terms than other major exporters. According to him, the American proposal included a significant reduction of tariffs on steel, aluminum, automobiles and lumber. But the Canadian Prime Minister called this concession nonsense and said that it did not correspond to the interests of his country. In general, let's analyze this topic in detail and answer the question of whether Donald Trump's trade war is really returning in full force. My name is Alexei Pesci, let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like the video and leave any comment you want. So, trade negotiations between Canada and the United States of America failed at the last minute on Friday evening Eastern Time, which once again reignited the trade war between the United States and Canada. At the same time, Ottawa promised to impose similar tariffs as Washington. Despite the encouraging statements from both sides that an agreement would soon be reached to avoid 50% American tariffs on a number of Canadian goods, the negotiations reached a deadlock, and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stated that the neighboring countries were unable to reach an agreement necessary to achieve Canada's goals. Here is his quote. As a result, this evening I made the decision to suspend trade negotiations with the United States and instructed Canadian negotiators to return to Ottawa. Currently, 50% tariffs have been imposed on Canadian goods worth $20 billion. And Carney immediately responded, quote, Canada will impose equivalent tariffs in full to protect our workers and businesses. Trump and Carney, as well as senior officials from the trade departments of both countries, maintained direct contact throughout the week. After Trump even granted a 3-day delay in the introduction of tariffs and stated that the agreement was already basically ready, it just needed to be finalized. Next is a quote from Trump, from Thursday. We reached an agreement with Canada, although it still needs the documents finalized. Well, in the end, as you understand, the documents were not finalized, and Trump rushed to announce the deal. At the same time, US Trade Representative Jamieson Greer started making excuses and said that supposedly the US offered Canada super cool terms, but Ottawa refused. Next is a quote from Greer. Despite the US offering Canada the very best terms compared to any major exporter to our market, the new demands and Canada's refusal of other commitments disrupted the carefully calibrated balance that had been achieved in recent days. Our offer included a significant reduction in tariffs on steel, aluminum, automobiles and lumber, as well as a historic economic partnership and the partnership in national security. However, Mark Carney then stated that changes to the terms of the agreement with the US, introduced at the last moment, were, quote, unfair, unprofitable, and called into question the reliability of any deal with Washington. Although he has not provided any details yet, but overall it's also important to keep in mind that the latest conflict was just a consequence of the steady deterioration of trade relations since Donald Trump returned to the presidency. Trump imposed tariffs on major Canadian industries, including the automotive, steel and aluminum sectors, while Canada responded with its own measures. Although Carney cancelled his most extensive countermeasures last year, Trump was still irritated by the bans imposed by Canadian provincial authorities on American products such as alcohol. He said it was unfair. And so the tariffs that came into effect last night are relatively limited in scope and cover goods imported from Canada worth about $20 billion. That's about 5% of the total value of goods imported into the US from its northern neighbor last year. By themselves, they are unlikely to have a significant impact on American consumers, who are already struggling due to high gas prices, which are a result of Trump's war with Iran. A more serious problem is the trade war that these tariffs are reigniting. In his Friday statement, Mark Carney said that his government will introduce additional measures to support Canadian workers and businesses. In addition to nearly $25 billion provided as support over the past 18 months, he stated that Canada's economic growth is accelerating and that Ottawa will not allow any country to determine its future. Therefore, it is clear that Carney is determined to fight to the end and will not make concessions to Trump. I would like to note that the United States of America did indeed consider the possibility of reducing tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminium and automobiles. Steel and aluminum were subject to tariffs of 50%, and the US authorities were considering the possibility of reducing them by half, that is to 25%. Meanwhile, Canadian automobiles were subject to tariffs of 25%. Moreover, the tariffs were applied only to components produced outside the United States, which allowed automakers to deduct the cost of American parts from the portion of the car that was subject to tariffs. And now the US authorities were discussing the possibility of lowering this rate to 15%. This was a response to the fact that Trump had long been complaining about the restrictions that Canada imposed on the ability of American dairy producers to sell their products in the dairy market. Although the country allows the import of American dairy products into its market, it still limits the volume of imports through quotas. And imports above these quotas can be subject to extremely high tariffs, which effectively limits further sales of American dairy products in this market. And here's something else interesting. In order to impose these tariffs, Trump is using a little-known law from the 1930s, which has never before been used to impose tariffs in this way. This move will almost certainly face legal challenges, just like many other attempts by the Trump administration to introduce new tariffs. But if the courts do not prevent Trump from using this law in this way, it could give him a powerful new method to impose tariffs of up to 50% on goods from Canada and possibly other partners. Whenever his administration believes that they are allegedly harming American trade. Unlike some other laws that Trump has resorted to, and by restoring his large-scale tariff regime after the Supreme Court's decision earlier this year. This trade law, known as Section 338, apparently does not set any time limits for the tariffs. This means that tariffs imposed under this law, a law that's almost 100 years old, can remain in effect indefinitely, unless Trump or a future president decides to remove them. And what's also important is that at the moment, Donald Trump hasn't imposed tariffs on many goods that the US relies heavily on Canada for, including energy products, critical minerals, and fish. But as you can imagine, this can change at any moment. So it looks like Donald Trump's trade war is coming back after all. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. And be sure to watch the next episode on this YouTube channel. You can see the link to it on your screen right now. That's all for now, take care of yourselves, goodbye everyone.